One night, I was curled up, watching my spookies. When I heard this guy say this.
And this, interestingly, relates to history to something that you probably don't know about called the Navajo Witch Purge of 1878. So, after a series of wars with the U.S.
I went to Google and was surprised to see that there was almost no information about this, except this expensive-ass book. I dug a little deeper and found some other articles. They all seemed to reference one another. And they all talked about different authors who wrote about the Navajo. And it was very interesting. But there wasn't anything specifically about the Purge. So, I did some more reading.
Knowledge.
And started getting into Navajo magic. But nothing gave me any insight into the Purge. I read some more about the author, Martha Blue, and she sounded legit. She taught indigenous people how to legally defend themselves, and she had a degree in Native American studies. And aside from all that, she chose to document Native American history in her free time. She sounded like a reputable source.
Reputable.
But I'd be damned if I spent that kind of money on a book, even if there were only 3 available online, and the printing press had closed decades ago. And it was an important part of Native American culture that I, honestly, as a YouTuber, had a duty to present.
And this, interestingly, relates to history to something that you probably don't know about called the Navajo Witch Purge of 1878. What's interesting is that during those years, during the walk, it's said that some of the tribe's members actually, like it says here, were said to have turned to shape-shifting to escape the terrible conditions. But once they were returned to their homeland and the conditions improved, the dreaded Skinwalkers, they didn't leave. They were still amongst the members on the reservation. So, accusations of witchcraft and the hunting of the Skinwalkers began, in which 40 suspected witches or Skinwalkers from the Navajo Nation were killed in order to try and restore harmony, peace, and balance to the tribe.
So, since this book was supposed to have information about Skinwalkers in it, I figured the most logical first step for me to do would be to look into what Skinwalkers are and try to understand that a little bit better.
A Skinwalker is essentially a witch that has chosen to put on the skin of a giant wolf.
Whoa.
What the hell?
Proof that Skinwalkers exist. What just did a backflip behind that?
Hold on, running down a hill and then a deer just gets up. Where'd that deer come from?
Oh my god, there it is, Mike. It came back. Oh my gosh. This thing is looking weird.
Want video evidence of a Skinwalker? He's looking right at me. He likes to make really weird fucking noises all night long.
Is that what Skinwalkers do?
Yep.
He'll keep making weird fucking noises. And I'll watch TikTok videos and just sort of ignore him. Now I know where he is.
Over there.
I think it might be a Skinwalker.
I think I need to go back there and maybe clear out the patch of woods. I gotta know some people that got some guns. Maybe we can get some ash. Light his ass up.
My research had taught me nothing. 20 hours of TikTok and YouTube, and somehow I had learned nothing useful. I guess it's possible that the people on TikTok— oh, fuck! I should just stick to reading papers. Like this paper, from 1974 by Terrell R. Palmer. An examination of Navajo witchcraft and its influence on the thoughts and actions of the Navajo people. Which is about exactly what it says it is. Palmer spent 6 years teaching at a boarding school for Navajo children. This paper contains his observations about their beliefs. Palmer never uses the term skinwalker, But he does define were-animals. It's defined as witches roaming in the skins of other animals, usually a wolf or coyote. And then later he defines wolfman as a common colloquial term for a witch. In this article written in 2012, Noah Nez writes that the Navajo word for skinwalker is Yinaldlushai, which translates literally to, with it, he goes on all fours. Later he writes, another suggestion points out that the practice of wearing dead animal skins and emulating them started for hunting purposes.
Without horses, they hunted like the wolves that followed the herds.
On TikTok and social media, a skinwalker has become a term that sort of means it's a creepy animal in the woods. When a hunter sees an animal doing something strange, it's a skinwalker. If an animal looks really diseased, like one of those zombie deer, skinwalker. Crackhead?
I think it might be a skinwalker.
And the popular show, Skinwalker Ranch, would have you believing that somehow skinwalkers are tied to UFOs, cow mutilations, and general poltergeist-like activity.
I saw her this morning, but she was alive.
But that shit's stupid. Okay, so let's just get through this segment. My best definition of a skinwalker, all things considered, is a Navajo man or woman who has turned to dark magic and witchcraft so that they can shapeshift and cast spells and curses, and people have expanded that today to explain a wide variety of unexplained creepy stuff. There. The book was still about 5 days from reaching me, so after checking up on skinwalkers, I figured the next best thing to do would be to read about Navajo history. By the mid-1800s, the American territory of New Mexico had been converged on by both English and Mexican settlers, which sparked confrontation with the indigenous Navajo. In 1846, the first peace treaty between the Navajo and the U.S. government was signed at Bear Springs. After the treaty was signed, certain elements of the Navajo ignored the treaty and continued to raid the New Mexican settlers, greatly upsetting the United States government. In 1849, the United States military marched a grand force into the heart of Navajo territory. The Navajo were addressed by the commanding officer, Colonel John Washington, and told, "You and us whites can still be friends if the Navajo come with their chiefs tomorrow and sign a treaty." Navajo culture traditionally didn't have central leadership, but the Mexican and American governments had demanded that the Navajo choose individuals to represent them in an official capacity. So out of necessity, the Navajo had chosen respected elders, which they called Hastines. These men were referred to as Natani by the Navajo and as chiefs by the settlers. The Hastines agreed to the meeting, and a peace talk was held the next day. During the talks, the United States was able to agree with the Navajo about its jurisdiction, and the Navajo agreed to let the American government build forts and postings inside of its territory. Just after the two sides came to an agreement, a New Mexican soldier suddenly accused one of the attending natives of riding a stolen horse. The young Native American denied this and, fearing consequence, ran away from the meeting. A fuss was made, and Colonel Washington came over and agreed with the New Mexican soldier and demanded the return of the stolen goods. When the Native Americans refused, Washington told the soldier to pick any horse he wanted as compensation from the Navajo, who all turned their backs and began to ride away. At this, Washington ordered his men to fire. Many of the Navajo fled to safety, but 7 were killed, and a prominent Hastine named Narbona had been mortally wounded. As he lay dying, one of the men from the fort came out and scalped him, keeping the hair as a trophy. He was then left to die. Despite this massacre, the American government put the treaty into full effect. Many Navajo were incensed, and a wave of anger swept through the tribes. The Treaty of 1849 was seen as a sham, and during this time a Hastine named Manuelito began to gain influence over the Navajo who no longer felt happy pursuing peace. In 1851, the government sent Colonel Edwin Sumner to wage war against the Navajo people, and by the terms of the treaty, he constructed Fort Defiance in the middle of their territory. Colonel Sumner attempted to fight his way into nearby Canyon de Chelly, but he and his men were constantly forced to retreat. Hey, editor me here. Just want to point out that for the entire video, I pronounce Canyon de Chelly incorrectly. It's actually pronounced Canyon de Chelly. I apologize for that. You're going to hear it a lot. Small battles and confrontations broke out over the next 5 years, and little military progress was made against the Navajo. In 1855, another treaty was signed, this time between Manuelito and an Indian agent named Henry Dodge. This treaty was again viewed by the Navajo as unfavorable. 2 years after that, the tribe got hit with a drought, which destroyed their crops and livestock and drove them into a famine for the winter. At the same time, surrounding tribes like the Utes began increasing their attacks on the Navajo, raiding what little they still had and kidnapping them into slavery. This time also damaged the Navajo internally as well. With its people desperate for food and supplies, feuds were developed between families, which further split the tribe. In 1858, Manuelito demanded that Fort Defiance stop letting their livestock graze in the most prominent Navajo pastures. In response, the soldiers shot 50 of Manuelito's cattle and 8 of his horses. For this, Navajo warriors attacked and killed a servant of the commanding officer. They saw it as retaliation for the people's livestock. The United States military then demanded that the murderers be brought to them, or they would begin a war with the Navajo. That war began in 1860, when the U.S. military, Mexican-American mercenaries, the Zunis, and the Utes all began raiding Navajo territory at the same time. Numerous battles were fought over the next several winter months. In April of the new year, 1,000 Navajo attacked Fort Defiance, led by 2 of the most prominent Hastin, Manuelito and Barboncito. At the time of the surprise attack, 150 American soldiers were stationed within Defiance. Somehow, they managed to assemble in the center of the fort and repel the attack. After the death of only 7 Navajo and 1 soldier, the attackers retreated. It marked the only time during the entire Mexican-American War that a native tribe had attacked an established, heavily manned fort. And to some people, that was an unforgivable offense. One of those people was a man named Manuel Antonio Chavez. Chavez had a long, violent history with the Navajo. When he heard of the attack on Fort Defiance, it offended him so deeply that he began an independent, unsanctioned campaign against the Navajo, formed from Mexican-American militias. For the next several months, Chavez raided Navajo territory, while U.S. soldiers destroyed their crops and livestock. At the start of 1861, another treaty was signed at a place that would later be called Fort Wingate, and Fort Defiance was decommissioned. However, afterwards, all sides just continued raiding as usual. A few months later, Fort Wingate held a horse race, and the local Navajo attended. One of them was accused of cheating by a New Mexican militiaman, so the commanding officer was called to resolve the issue. Unfortunately for everyone, that man was now Manuel Chavez. Clearly unsympathetic, he ordered his men to fire on the Navajo, and just like before, several died while most ran away. Again, obviously, the Navajo were furious, and they commenced even more persistent and violent raids on the New Mexican people. In 1862, the U.S. government became concerned with the Civil War. The Navajo took full advantage of this and focused even more on raiding, fearing little, if any, military intervention. In 1863, General James Henry Carleton issued an ultimatum to the Navajo: surrender or be crushed. They did not surrender. So Carleton enlisted famous mountain man Kit Carson to pillage and burn the Navajo wherever he could find them, and to send as many prisoners as possible to Fort Sumner and Bosque Redondo. Until January 1864, Carson burned down numerous Navajo homes and destroyed crop fields. 1864 was the final stand for the Navajo. Being endlessly pursued from their homes by the U.S. and facing winter with nearly no provisions, the Navajo began to surrender. One by one, each tribe turned itself over to U.S. forces. and over the course of 2 years, they were all put on the path to Bosque Redondo. Between 1863 and 1866, thousands of Navajo were sent to the reservation of Bosque Redondo. At least 3 major migrations occurred, with the Army's chosen path sometimes being as far as 400 miles. The Navajo were never told where they were going, or how far it would be, and they were often not allowed to bring supplies or prepare for the trip at all. There are stories of pregnant women or old people being shot by the Army when they couldn't continue. Many became sick or malnourished. Conditions were so miserable that many of the Navajo began to believe that their gods had literally abandoned them. In desperation, several Navajo attempted to flee, and some were successful. Rumors began to circulate amongst some of the exhausted Navajo that these escapees had gotten away through the aid of shape-shifting, turning themselves into coyotes and rabbits and mice, and slipping by unseen by the Army. Here's the thing. I had this whole part edited and written out in the first draft, and I realized that I don't know the actual origin of this claim, that some Navajo anamorphs to freedom.
Were said to have turned to shape-shifting to escape the terrible conditions.
I went through all my stuff and remembered it came from that Noah Nez article. In it, he says, this reported incident, which is the witch purge, is said to come from the days of the Long Walk of the Navajo. Apparently, it was during these dire times that some Navajo people would shapeshift to escape their impoverished living conditions. He doesn't provide a source for that. Above this, he mentions the article by Allison, and directly following that, he mentions the author Raymond Locke. The article by Allison, it's definitely not the source of the Anamorphs to Freedom story. So maybe it came from Raymond Locke. These are the rest of Noah's references right here. My point is that this seems important to figure out. Maybe it's common knowledge, and I just don't know, and my research sucks balls, which is totally possible. Or maybe Noah made it up, although that seems unlikely. Really, it's not a matter of whether or not people shapeshifted. It's whether or not this was a real thing that the Navajo spoke about to each other, a thing that they actually believed happened, or if it's just a story, invented through a journalistic game of telephone. I don't know the answer to that. And I wish I did, because I think it's as close to the true origin of the Skinwalker myth as anything else that I've read. Whatever. Shapeshifting, skinwalkers, all that stuff aside, the long walk was beyond horrific. It was essentially a death march.
We pulled them behind a huge rock, and we screamed out loud when we heard the gunshots. The women didn't make a sound, but we cried out loud for them and their babies. I felt then I would not live through everything. When we crossed the Rio Grande, many people drowned. We didn't know how to swim. There was hardly any water deep enough to swim in at home. Some babies, children, and some of the older men and women were swept away by the river current. We must not ever forget their screams and the last we saw of them. Hands, a leg, or strands of hair floating. There were many who died on the way to Huerta. All the way we told each other, we will be strong as long as we are together.
Bosque Redondo was terrible. The land was intended to house 5,000 people, but there were at least 8,500 Navajo. Plus, the government had already placed 400 Apaches there. And they and the Navajo had a long history of raiding each other, so obviously there were a lot of fights right from the beginning. The water was bad, the forest was small, there wasn't enough firewood. The ground was not good for growing, and the crops repeatedly failed or got infested with worms. Despite being guarded by the military, the Navajo were constantly raided, and they themselves were also raiding nearby settlers. The supplies provided to the reservation, which cost the government $1.5 million a year, were consistently mismanaged and sometimes deliberately withheld in power plays. Sickness and infighting were rampant. In 1865, Navajo began to slip away from the reservation. In 1867, the residents refused to plant a crop. In 1868, the U.S. gave up on the effort. Hearing the stories of terrible living conditions, the U.S. sent a peace delegation to the Navajo to try to arrive at a new agreement. The Navajo were represented primarily by Barboncito and Manuelito, both of whom insisted that they be allowed to return home as a condition of the treaty. So, a treaty was signed, the reservation was closed, and the Navajo were put back on the road, this time to their original homelands. They were 2,000 fewer when they journeyed back. Life at Bosque Redondo had killed 1 in 4. Before the war and all the troubles, the Navajo numbered around 25,000. They now consisted of roughly 6. When the tribe got back home, they were a shadow of what they had been. Their culture had been severely disrupted, and their sense of community had been almost entirely extinguished. So over the next decade, Hastine, like Manuelito, focused heavily on returning culture and community to his people, but problems persisted. So now, finally, we're at the point of the video, which is the Witch Purge. Martha Blue begins her book with a summary of the 10 years following the signing of the Treaty of 1868. The Navajo have returned home and spread out over their territory. The Hastine are losing respect. Indian agents, officers specially hired to act as middlemen between any given tribe and the White House, are spread thin, and relying more on the help of the fading Natani to control the tribes. In turn, the Natani were entrusted with the dispersion of annuity goods granted by the government, but this only caused more distrust to manifest against the chosen Hastine. Fort Defiance was reestablished. The Navajo began to raid again, and things carried on like this for a few years. In 1878, a man named J.L. Hubble bought a trading post in the Ganado region of Navajo territory. For the first few years, it wasn't much but tents and temporary buildings, but it ended up being one of the most important locations in the area for settler and Navajo alike, so the Hubble family prospered. They also enjoyed a fairly conflict-free lifestyle, given the necessity of their family trade. But in 1878, mere months after they had established, that lack of conflict was put to the test when the Hubble trading post found itself at the center of a conflict between the Navajo. Martha Blue begins the story with a man named Amos Johnson. Johnson was interviewed in 1970 at the age of 57 about his grandfather's involvement in the Witch Purge. In 1878, a man from the tribes near Canyon de Chili named Hastine Bawasi began to feel jealous of his neighbors. Some Navajo were raiding and having fine children and beautiful homes, but Bawasi and his people sat by watching and growing angry. Bawasi and his clan began to cast spells on their neighbors, seizing their waste and trash and burying these items in graves so the targets would become ill. Bawasi and his clan would hold meetings, and they would question how these families became so fortunate, how they were so wealthy and cared for. They suspected foul play, an unfair advantage, so they too played unfair and aimed to handicap this progress. Bawasi instructed the young people of the clan to go out as spies, to become employed by and married to these selected individuals, and wait for opportunities to cause more injury. These deceptions were planned over years. Crops failed, people died, and entire families were separated from their material goods. One day, 4 men, one of them Amos Johnson's great-grandfather, decided that something must be done about the apparent witchcraft. So they went to the Hastine, Ganado Mucho, and all together they searched for the offending medicine men. By 1878, Bawasi and his family had been identified, and the death of him and his clan became the Hastine's top priority. On May 31st, the Hubble Trading Post was being ran by Charles Hubble, brother of much more famous Juan Lorenzo Hubble, who was maintaining the post in his brother's absence. That evening, the local postmaster at nearby Fort Defiance began receiving multiple frantic letters from Charles. They relay the following account.
There is a big row going on here, among the Indians. They just killed one of them, and we are in danger of our lives. A big crowd just passed here, and they're going to fix themselves to go on a fight at Canyon de Chalet. And the Indians around here are expecting a war party from Canyon de Chalet to come here for a big fight. The boy was killed in front of Hardison's house. He was beaten down with rocks and plugged full of arrows, and they're going to kill Bawasi and 4 others.
In Charles' second letter, he says an old Indian named Genio or Jono came into the post just after sending his first letter, to warn him that a huge Indian war party was coming from Canyon de Chalet, and that the Indian has warned him that all of the white people and important supplies are in danger, and they're going to kill all of us and steal everything, and you should send soldiers immediately. We will be dead in 2 days. Genio was Ganado Mucho, a Hastine Charles had had no interaction with until this point. In a third letter, Charles says, "Forget 2 days, we're all going to die tonight." He writes,
The very latest news is that they killed Bawasi, that the war party has not gotten here and things look very blue, and if we have received reliable information, that they would be here in a large body to avenge the death of Bawasi. We will, the whites, clear out for Fort Defiance tonight, as we have no means of holding out against a superior force. We do not think it would be policy for us to risk our own lives when nothing can be gained by it.
Martha Blue says that after the fact, it's pretty clear that these letters were manipulative. There really was no danger to white people in particular, and no Native Americans had any interest in destroying any of the supplies at the trading post. That would have just hurt them as much as anybody else. Charles and Ganado Mucho were both just amping up the situation. You know, basically just saying whatever would get the soldiers there the fastest. And Ganado knew that if you say white people in danger, white supplies in danger, then it would get the army there quicker. Martha Blue then moves on to a different informant, one only called Ganado Mucho's grandson. He describes these first killings as such. That morning, a man named Haloish John and another named Black Boy were killed. John was killed by Ganado Lake. They led him around out there for a while, torturing him until he said what he knew. Then they killed him. While the man lived, he said, "Hurry up and kill us all, or at least try. You won't. Bawasi is our leader, and we have buried some of your belongings. We have sung you into the ground. You are all already dead." He was forced to tell where he buried these belongings, and he said near here, by Ganado Lake. The Navajo went where he said, and they indeed found items buried in an old grave. But they were too afraid to handle these items themselves, so they enlisted the help of a Hubble, possibly Charles, to ride out and unearth these cursed objects. When Charles presented his find, the Navajo were troubled to see that many of their people's belongings were wrapped in a copy of the Treaty of 1868. It had all been buried in the belly of a dead man, and it clearly called death upon those who respected the 1868 treaty. Although Charles never confirms this Navajo claim, Martha Blue supposes that even if Charles did do this, he would never admit it, either because he didn't believe in the Navajo magic, or he feared bullying from other whites who may have found out he supported such silly Navajo superstition. Regardless, several other Navajo claim this event happened, as evidenced by the fact that the trading post was then moved, following advice from local medicine men that places of killings were haunted. Although if this event did motivate the Hubbles to relocate, it was likely to not upset the future Navajo business prospects with fears of ghosts. After that, Blue continues the story told by Ganado Mucho's grandson. Pastim Bawasi heard about the plans to kill him, so he went to his home in Valle de Chili. People started gathering from Ganado and other regions like Greasewood and Cleggtoe, and they armed themselves and went together to Bawasi's home in a mob numbering at least 50. On the way, they met a woman who told them Bawasi was not at the home, but instead attending a sing somewhere in Cornfield. The mob went there and found the ceremony taking place in a teepee, and they surrounded it. Those attending the sing exited the home and asked what the mob wanted, and they said they wanted to kill Bawasi. This mob was led by Ganado Mucho, and he was highly respected, so the people didn't argue. But Bawasi did not exit the teepee. Ganado Mucho went to enter the home, but he was blocked by another Hastin. The man held his arms between the teepee posts and said, "This man is my clan. I can't in good faith allow this to happen." So Ganado Mucho gave a great speech about the ways that Bawasi had earned his death. Ganado's speech convinced the man to move away from the door, and he told the mob to do what they wanted with him. The crowd began yelling and riding their horses around the teepee. Some threw ropes around the logs that supported it and pulled them away, leaving a twisted covering and an entryway. Ganado Mucho peered through a window in the home and saw Bawasi climbed above the entry, hiding, so he reached in and shot him. He then went in and dragged Bawasi out, who was still alive. The mob surrounded him and stoned him so badly that his entire body was unrecognizable. In the end, he was nothing but a pile of rocks. Bawasi has since been identified by historians as a Hastin from the Chinle area, who signed the 1868 treaty in Bosque Redondo under the name Muerto de Hombre. He might even be in this picture. Martha Blue returns to Charles. All of Charles's letters had gone to Leonard, the post-trader at Fort Defiance, who gave them to Indian agent and real piece of shit John Pyle, who sent them to Colonel P.T. Swain, commanding officer at Fort Wingate, who dispatched 2 lieutenants, McGonigal and Mitchell, to go off and, quote, protect the whites and their property, but on no account to take an active part in the difficulties between the Indians themselves. If possible, get them to agree to a peaceable solution or resolution of their difficulties. The agent, Pyle, attributes the hostilities to their superstitions in reference to witchcraft and the supernatural powers of the medicine men, and this, doubtless, is the outgrowth of old trouble on the subject. Agent Pyle wrote in his journal about the death of 2 shamans, resulting in a fiasco, likely referring to Haloish John and Black Boy. Later he wrote that 4 or 5 medicine men had been corralled at a local camp, and says, quote, the medicine men are in a fair way to be murdered by a mob of fanatic Indians. The superstitions of these people are the great drawback and obstacle of their civilization. They are firm believers in witchcraft and the supernatural powers of the medicine men. Are they any worse than the Sulamites with their superior civilization? The next day he writes of going, against his better judgment, to the camp to see what's going on. In short, he accomplishes nothing, as he expected. Sleeps on an animal skin, which he hates, and eats a sad breakfast before heading back to Fort Wingate in the morning. Basically, he sucked. That's what he wrote in his journal about it. Luckily, McGonigal and Mitchell were more understanding of the situation. They first met with the Hubbles, and it seemed like the trouble had more or less subsided. So they decided to go find Ganado Mucho and check up on the Navajo side of things. They had a sit down, and McGonigal fully understood the nature of the Navajo problems, that they had stemmed from a feud over witchcraft, and that it had been more or less dealt with, and people were content again. He relays as much in a letter sent to Fort Wingate. McGonigal then told McGonigal then told Ganado Mucho that they weren't there to interfere, but he wanted to know how the people knew for sure that Bawasi had killed their friends. In the letters back to Wingate, he writes, they replied they knew it because the doctors shot stones into their bodies, and Ganado Mucho said that the doctors confessed to the killing of some of his relatives, and that the doctors put grass, hair, horse, and sheep dung in his brother's grave. McGonigal also writes about the Indian agent Pyle, saying, during the council, the Indian agent, Mr. Pyle, told them that they were very foolish to believe such things, that it was all nonsense, but was unable to convince them of their wrong belief. Unsurprisingly, Ganado Mucho paid almost no attention to Agent Pyle. with McGonagall noting that he never listened to him about anything. Pyle even wrote in his journal after the two had met that, quote, His Excellency Ganado Mucho spoke through the interpreter, saying he was not favorably impressed with their new agent. He found me cold, stiff, and formal. Colonel Swain back at Wingate had even written Pyle a note one time, attached to something work-related, that said, It is useless to try to convince Indians that their superstitions are erroneous, and they will place little faith in us if we deny the truth of what they assert. During the talks, a Navajo from Canyon de Chalet arrived and told Ganado Mucho that the people in his area were incensed by Bawasi's murder, and they wanted to kill Ganado Mucho in retaliation. It's unknown if any group ever showed up to do this. The talks were concluded, and the men traveled back to Wingate. The captured witches were left up to the judgment of the tribe. Even though Bawasi and his family had been dealt with, that wasn't the end of the issue. 2 months later, in June, Manuelito entered the Hubble trading post and asked Juan Lorenzo to pen a letter for him. It says, Manuelito wishes me to write to you about the troubles. He says that the Navajo have got 6 men tied up and wishes you would write a letter to the officers that are at Pueblo, Colorado, to tell the medicine men not to kill any more people. He wishes also to say to them that he would like them to go to where they have the Indians tied, that the Navajos are going to fight each other there, and that the officers can give the medicine men perhaps a good talking to and tell them not to kill any more of their best people. The place they are tied is a place north of Defiance, and he says to tell the soldiers to go there as fast as possible, that one of his cousins was killed the other day, that he saw them do it. He says that they have threatened to kill him, and he wishes you to say to them to leave him alone. Navajos are prospering now. Everything is well, except for the medicine men, and as soon as they stop doing any harm, there is nothing left to trouble them. This letter was directed towards Colonel Swain at Wingate, and Blue points out that it circumvented Indian Agent Pyle, likely on purpose, and probably because of how unsympathetic towards the Navajo Manuelito perceived him to be. On June 10th, Colonel Swain once again dispatched Lieutenant Mitchell to the affected region to solve the issue. Along the way, his unit picked up Juan Lorenzo in Navajo City, and together, the party made its way to the Tanisha Mountain Valley. When they arrived, they met with the people and found 3 Navajo doctors tied up for what Mitchell would describe later as malpractice, or witchcraft, specifically the act of shooting stones into bodies. The Navajo highly respected the skill of oration. It's traditionally a large part of their conflict resolution. When Ganado Mucho spoke to the mob to move the man from the door blocking access to Bawasi, or when Barboncito spoke to the peace delegation in the Bosque to allow his people to return to their land. Lieutenant Mitchell had observed moments like those, and understood the importance of them, so he dragged the 3 accused men into the center of the crowd and delivered a powerful lecture. The Americans no longer disbelieve in this shooting stones business, and it must be stopped. This thing of certain Indians killing others in the same tribe is an outrage, and it will no longer be tolerated. I'm here to make sure that Indian doctors promise to stop. Lieutenant Mitchell spoke for a while, and he concluded the entire thing by saying, If they continue to act killing like a lot of dogs, then the tribe will be split up into factions, and other tribes like the Utes will come in and steal their cows and their sheep and their horses, and they will be left penniless and finally annihilated, and the tribe will become extinct. He then told the interpreter to signal that he was done, but the Navajo expressed concern that the medicine men would just return to their malpractice in a matter of months. But Mitchell concluded the talks for the day, content in his answer. The next day, more medicine men accused of witchcraft were brought into the camp, led by Ganado Mucho, and another 100 Navajo were accompanying him to see what the commotion at the camp was all about. Mitchell took advantage of this and called all of them together to hear his speech again, except he ended it this time by asking anyone in the crowd with a magic stone throwing kit to come forward and demonstrate it upon a nearby tree. Nobody accepted the offer, except one old man who said that he knew how, but he couldn't do it in front of other Navajo. His wife then started yelling at the interpreter that the old man had killed people, and the old man admitted it. He then offered up his medicine kit and promised his wife he would stop. Lieutenant Mitchell ended his talk and asked the Navajo if they were happy with his handling of the issue. And he wrote later on that the great majority replied in the affirmative and insisted on shaking hands. The next day was food distribution at Fort Defiance, and 3,000 Navajos showed up, including several Hastin like Ganado Mucho. When people saw that Lieutenant Mitchell was present, he was asked again by the people to give a small speech, which he did, and again many people shook his hand and thanked him. Mitchell seems very proud of these moments in his writings. It's again unclear what happened to the accused witches. On June 21st, real piece of shit John Pyle came back to work from wherever the hell he'd been during all this, and penned a letter back to his commissioner at the Indian Affairs Agency. And no joke, it was about whether or not the military, namely Colonel Swain and Mitchell, had any authority to step into Indian agent affairs, because he was annoyed that he didn't get to deal with the issue himself, or something. The next day in his diary, he wrote that he wondered how uncomfortable the Navajo must have been when Colonel Swain sent Mitchell and not him. And he gloats a little about how his letter questioning the military's authority over Indian affairs will undoubtedly cause potential minor chaos in Washington. According to Martha Blue, in official records, this is the end of the Purge. But according to John Pyle's diary, these events continued the next month. On July 6th, he wrote, "Today, 2 or 3 chiefs and their witnesses from the east side were to have confronted Captain Chiquito and perhaps other medicine men accused of malpractice at the agency, but neither the accused or their accusers put in an appearance. But a messenger was sent in with word that they were in search of other bad doctors and would be a day or 2 late with the trial. Superstition, mixed with personal and sectional jealousy, keeps these ignorant creatures in a continual state of turmoil and fear of each other, and there's no hope of anything better than the present generation." On the 9th, he wrote, "Word came from the north today that a son of Captain Chiquito had suffered death at the hands of Mariano's band, simply because he was the son of a doctor who was accused of practicing witchcraft. Superstition prevails to such an extent among this unhappy people as to make them all afraid of each other. They have been talked to, berated, and laughed at concerning their absurd beliefs, all to no purpose. No change can be effected in the matter of disabusing their minds of these false notions until it can be educated out of them." And then on July 3rd, he notes that he drove to the fort, and Manuelito Ganado Mucho Mariano and about 40 other Navajos of lesser note came into the post to have a big medicine talk about the irregularities of some of their medicine men and women accused of practicing witchcraft. The chiefs could not conceal a look of disappointment at seeing me there, for they evidently wanted to have their talk with the officers. They were not long in finding out, however, that I was the man before whom they should bring their troubles. This is the point where Martha Blue concludes the story. Blue's retelling of events takes place over about a 6-month period, but other historians like Cluckone believe the full effects of the witch purge lasted upwards of 10 years, spanning before and after Blue's timeline, during what some refer to as the social reconstruction era of the Navajo, after life at the Bosque. In this story, we were provided 2 forms of evidence: spoken Navajo history as relayed by descendants, often through interpreters, and written documentation from the military and the Hubbles. Despite the Navajo accounts being only oral history and passed down from person to person, the written documentation supports nearly all of these retellings, solidifying them against scrutiny. But with all that said, this purge was undoubtedly happening in between the select moments presented in the book, and I believe it was always present in the background during this Reconstruction era. I'm positive that numerous instances of witch execution were simply not recorded or reported to the US officials during this time, probably because the Navajo didn't think they needed help every single time it happened. Many of the retellings of this event online put the number of dead at about 40, but the book only remarks on the killing of maybe 10. If Cluckone's 10-year theory is correct, it's possible that the purge killed many more than 40, but honestly, it seems impossible to ever really know. the Witch Purge, as recounted by Martha Blue, makes no mention of skinwalking. From what I've read, there is no connection between claims of shapeshifting during the Long Walk and the events of 1878, outside of the normal, typical, everyday witch behaviors that get one purged. I think that this is an interesting story that appears in all ways to have been told accurately. And I think that nowadays it's somewhat been hijacked and changed to fit a more paranormal narrative for internet spookies. Honestly, I don't think anyone has done this on purpose. I just think from a glance, the Witch Purge is easily woven into the history of skinwalkers, partly because it feels like it fits, and partly because it's just cool. It's a cool story, just like Salem, but for Native Americans, and that the Skinwalker curse never died and that it lived on and it moved to a ranch in Utah and started making UFOs for the History Channel. It's a great story.
It's fiction. It's an urban legend that never happened. It never happened.
It's not as mystical as it was all made out to be, but it's still interesting, and I do think it's a story that we shouldn't forget or hold behind a $120 paywall, because it's important, I think. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye. Utah.